This is going to be informative, insightful, and it's going to make a difference in the 2012 Iowa caucuses. So please, if you will, join me in what may be the next president of the United States. Let's welcome the candidates for 2012 in the Iowa caucuses. If there are any photographers, Congresswoman.
Hi, Frank. Thank you.
Hi, here. Right up there is a focus group of moms that are taking place. You all set?
Jar, doesn't it?
I want to begin by thanking Representative Bachmann for taking care of the water for today's event.
I'm used to it, Frank.
It is like Thanksgiving.
I poured a lot of water in my time.
I assure you that these are actually not props if anyone wants to take the pumpkins home when this is done.
Yeah.
There you go, Mariner.
For a $10 contribution.
That's right.
To the family leader. There you go. Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'd like to begin in a different way than what most debates have begun. And now I have to let the Congresswoman actually get the first question because she just gave me water. Actually, Dr. Paul, I'd like to begin with you. Every debate begins with a specific policy question, but this is a little different. Someone on this stage hopes to be able to take the oath of office 14 months from now. And at the end of that oath are the words, "So help me God." When you hear those 4 words, if you have the opportunity and the privilege to say them, what will come to mind?
Well, I think they're very important. We take, those of us who have been in Congress and served in government, we take an oath frequently. We take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And that's what we do when we take an oath when we're sworn in as president. We emphasize this. But I think what that does, it emphasizes it even more so because of the significance and the importance. And it reiterates the fact that we swear to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. And to me, this would mean that you're not only saying this, in front of a small number of people, not only in front of the nation, but before our God, which means the significance is that much greater. So those of us who have done this before, and I've taken my oath rather seriously, very seriously, and believe that I've done a very good job in upholding the Constitution, and even when sometimes it's difficult. And this, to me, would send the signal that by saying, "So help me God," I really will obey the Constitution and that pledge.
Anybody else?
For me,
Go ahead.
it's really 2 things. So help me God means that I am ultimately responsible to God Almighty. And secondly, it is an expression, in my view, of asking for God to help me in such an important job.
Congresswoman?
Well, it reminds me that it was George Washington that added those last 4 words, "So help me God." And after he added those 4 words, he reached down and he kissed the Bible. And I think it's because if there was any American who had seen the hand of God rising up this nation, it was George Washington. He literally said, without the aid of Providence, we wouldn't have had this land. And I think the time that we're in right now in this country is also at such a critical time. Without his hand, we won't be able to get back on track. And I know in my own life, I was born here in Iowa and baptized here in Iowa, but it wasn't until I was 16 that I actually gave my life over to the Lord. And that's when I got on my knees, admitted I was a sinner. I gave my heart to Jesus Christ. And I recognize that my actions just aren't about this world. I'll have to answer to God in the next world. And that's a part, I think, of being president. When you take that oath, we're answerable to God for the decisions that we make.
What happened? I've heard you say this before. What happened when you were 16? Was there an event that caused you to say, I don't want to live this way anymore?
There was. I mean, I recognized that I was a sinner, and I also had the Holy Spirit knocking on my heart's door.
But what caused that to happen?
Well, I think it was the prayer of my friends around me. I thought I was a Christian, and my friends saw that I really didn't know Jesus personally. And so they prayed for me. They prayed me into the kingdom, and the Holy Spirit started calling me and knocking on my heart's door. And I bowed my heart and recognized that I couldn't make it on my own. I needed a sinner, or I needed a Savior. I was a sinner, and I gave my heart to Him. And I'm not a perfect person today by any means, but what I recognize is that He is perfect. He is the Savior, and I put myself and my hands in His.
Governor?
The words are so powerful. Being the President of the United States has got to be the hardest job in the world. And the idea that one of us sitting around this table could do it with our own human intellect or capability is beyond any of us. And we have to have that eternal wisdom that comes from God. And so help me God is almost a plea. It's not part of an oath. I look at it as a plea. So God, I've been driven to my knees multiple times as the governor of the state of Texas, Rick, making decisions that are life and death, that have huge impacts on people's lives. And to the idea that I would walk into that without God Almighty holding me up would scare me to death.
Senator Santorum, the people, the 3,000 people who are here, believe that America's in trouble and believe that America's in pain. But this is all about setting priorities. You speak often of values, but what's the number one value that America has lost, and how would you get it back?
Well, I think it really talks about what we're just talking about, which is understanding that America is a country that was founded on the concept that our rights come to us from our Creator. Rights come to us from God. And that when God gives us rights, He doesn't say, well, here are your rights, just do whatever you want to do with them. That in fact, He has laws that we must abide by. Now, unlike Islam, where the higher law and the civil law are the same, in our case, we have civil laws, but our civil laws have to comport with the higher law. Our civil laws have to, and that's why the issue of abortion, as long as abortion is legal, at least according to the Supreme Court, legal in this country, we will never have rest, because that law does not comport with God's law, which says that all life has value. All life is created by, I knew you in the womb. And as long as there is a discordance between the two, there will be agitation. And I feel very, very blessed, and sort of trying to meld these two questions together, because I wanted to get a comment in there, that when I won my first race, it was a miracle race. I had no chance of winning. And so I was blessed because God always has to hit me over the head harder than everybody else for me to see. And I really felt blessed that I knew at that moment when I won, I had a constituency of one. And I always felt that way. I always felt like, that God had sort of pulled me out and given me this opportunity. But I got to tell you, it took me to the United States Senate to really see what God had in store for me.
So can I ask you then, what message was God sending to you when you lost your race for the U.S. Senate?
Well, can I first tell you the good news? I mean, come on, you sort of glossed over the good news to get me. I'll get to that. But
quickly.
In the United States Senate, I felt like I always say that I came to the United States Senate and I found the Lord, and I really do believe that. And it was a blessing of people who, just like Michelle, who prayed for me and asked me to join a Bible study. And I had a great chaplain of the Senate that helped me. And that process opened up to me why I was there, what God was calling me to do. And that's one of the things I'll never forget in my time in the Senate and my time, hopefully, as president, is to make sure that as I did, I had a small group. I had people I was accountable to about my faith, not about what the policy, but about my faith, about my family, because those are the first two things. And if you have those in line, everything else will probably be in line too.
Speaker Gingrich, you have written a great deal about the loss of values in this country, but if you had to identify just one that you specifically want to see reinstilled and how you would do it, which one would that be?
I think that's very easy. It would be to ensure that every American understood that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and therefore you had to explain the word Creator. And I wouldn't have anybody teaching who felt uncomfortable explaining what the Founding Fathers meant when they said that our rights come from our Creator, because it changes everything else. Secular is a term that comes actually from the Latin seculare, meaning a century. And it basically says life is very limited, so you might as well get the most you can now. A belief in God is the precise opposite. It's a belief that we are all part of an eternity, and that eternity stretches behind us and ahead of us. And therefore, we have to measure what we do within the framework of God's greater plan. A country which has been now, since 1963, relentlessly in the courts driving God out of public life shouldn't be surprised at all the problems we have, because we've in fact attempted to create a secular country, which I think is frankly a nightmare. So I think the first step is this is not sectarian. It's not Protestant, Catholic, Jewish. This is a factual, historic statement. Our founding document, which is the base of our government, says we are endowed by our Creator, and therefore we have responsibilities as citizens to that Creator. And if we simply have a system that reasserts that and educates that and tries to live up to that, we will be a dramatically better country, and other policies follow from it.
So then what accounts for this hostility?
Yeah, well said.
What accounts, and this is for anyone, for this hostility, that there will be people who will tune in to this conversation as it has just started, and they won't understand it, and it'll even frighten them. Why is there this difference between these 3,000 people and those on stage and what I see coming from other places? Because as a focus group moderator, I hear it all the time.
Yeah, I wrote a book about this called It Takes a Family. The bottom line is that the left has co-opted and taken over the academic institutions of this country, and starting with higher education, but now, thanks in part to federal government control of education, now primary and secondary education.
So why don't you take it back?
They've taken over the culture, the popular culture.
Why don't you take it back?
That's exactly what at least I did when I was out in the private sector. You have to mention I lost my last race, so when I got out in the private sector, that's what I did. I actually joined with some friends and started a little technology company to try to take the culture back, to try to help parents not have to have that filth come through the television. And we worked on a little technology company to do it. I've worked when I was in the United States Senate with Hollywood, with people to try to help shape the culture. Because Hollywood, as we all know, culture is downstream from politics. And unless we change the storytelling in America, it's going to be hard to change the political structure.
Can Hollywood be shaped?
Absolutely. I mean, you're seeing it now. You look at a guy like Phil Anschutz, who started Walden Media, and trying to produce quality films and documentaries. Look at this church in Alabama that's put forward Fireproof and Courageous. And this is an obligation for all of us. This isn't just for leaders. This is for all of us. All of us have an obligation to engage the culture. Don't hide from it. We hide from it. We leave the barren square for the others to pollute the rest of our society.
Dr. Paul, and then Mr. King.
Yeah. I think the issue is obviously very important, and we can charge one side or the other of influencing our culture too much. But the goal of government isn't to mold society and mold people. The role of government is to preserve liberty so we as individuals assume the responsibility and our families assume responsibility. Our values should come from our family and from our church. But once we say, well, the liberals are doing this because they want this economic interference and we're going to have perfect balance and fairness, they overdo it. But you can do it on both sides. You can say, well, we're going to make people better by having more laws. I think culture is very important. Culture has a reflection on the law, and I think that is very good. But the law can't reflect the morality of the people. If you do that, you have embarked on something where you sacrifice liberty. Once you turn this over to government, when government assumes this role, it can only do that at the sacrifice of liberty. So our goal ought to be to preserve liberty so that we have our religious values and we make our own decisions. If we can make our self-determination for our hereafter and our spiritual life, certainly on our own personal habits and our economic habits and how we spend our money, certainly we should assume that the people can do this. The guidance should come from individuals, from our family, and from our church.
Mr. Kane and then Speaker Gingrich.
I would answer that question this way. What we are seeing is a wider gap between people of faith and people of non-faith. Now, even within the group that are people of faith, you have people who have stronger faith than others. Most people who are people of faith, it grows with age and it grows with time. So you have that division, people of faith and people of non-faith. Secondly, those of us that are people of faith and strong faith have allowed the non-faith element to intimidate us into not fighting back. I believe we've been too passive. We have maybe pushed back, but as people of faith, we have not fought back.
And how do you fight back?
The way you fight back is not be afraid to express your faith in any setting rather than worrying about the political correctness police.
In research that my own firm has done about the difference between those who pray every day and attend church at least once a week, those who do so are happier, healthier, have closer relationships to their family, like their job better, are more likely to volunteer, are more likely to give of their time. With all the strata, all the positive things that we would say that we want human beings to do, there's a direct correlation. And those that don't, the people who do not pray and do not attend church at all, have the worst. They're the most unhappy and the most angry. And yet you seem to be always under attack.
Sure.
Why?
Well, because they're unhappy and they're angry.
Yeah, they're unhappy, yeah.
I mean, you just explained it. You know, Arthur.
I'm supposed to do the jokes here.
No.
Go ahead.
It's the first time you behave like the media. Now, look, Arthur Brooks wrote similar stuff, as you know, and has done a brilliant job of explaining the fundamental difference using Gallup data between conservatives who tend to be happier and liberals who tend to be more miserable. And that's just objective, self-reported data. It's not a judgment. But here are the two core problems. And I think to some extent it'd be interesting to pursue this, Ron, because I think we probably do disagree at one level. I don't think liberty means libertine. I don't think liberty means absence of value. None of the founding fathers thought liberty meant that. The pursuit of happiness in the 18th century Enlightenment meant wisdom and virtue. The 1780s said that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 to organize Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin says religion, morality, and knowledge being important, we need schools. It was the Pelosi House that cut off the first three words and said knowledge being important. None of the founding fathers would have said that education without character is useful. They would have said it's in fact dangerous. And what you have today What you have today is an outgrowth of the French Revolution. Gertrude Himmelfarb's brilliant book on Three Enlightenments captures it perfectly. The French Revolution was an anti-clerical, anti-God rejection of the larger world in favor of secularism. It has dominated our academic world. Our academic world supplies our news media and our courts and Hollywood. And so you have a faction in America today which believes things which are profoundly wrong. Now, that is a fight. That's not a passivity. And a culture in which they know what they're doing and they are determined to destroy our value system, and we are passive or confused, is a world in which America is going to stay in deep trouble.
Governor.
Frank, here you asked the question, what are we going to do about it? And I think that is the more operative question. We've sat here and identified what the problem is. But over the course of the years as the governor of the state of Texas, I have been actively engaged with an effort called Pastors in Pews, where we bring pastors together and we talk about public policy. We had an event in August the 6th, I believe, in Houston that got a little bit of press called The Response, where we brought people all across the state and the country together to pray for this country. And my challenge for all of you and for every elected official out there, for every governor and for the next president of the United States, is to not be afraid to be a faithful individual every day, to live that life, to stand up for your values, to be able, if you are a pastor, you need to be in the pulpit every Sunday and frankly, every day that you have the opportunity to be in that pulpit, talking about values, because values are going to get decided. Somebody's values are going to decide what the Congress votes on or what the President of the United States is going to deal with. And the question is, whose values? And let me tell you, it needs to be our values, values and virtues that this country was based upon in Judeo-Christian founding fathers.
So let me ask you as a follow-up, and then Dr. Paul, if those pastors are speaking about values, do you also want them to speak about politics?
I want them to use the values. The politics will take care of itself. The people in the pews, I'm pretty sure, are smart enough to figure out the politics of their own. But to powerfully talk about individuals who are not supporting the virtues and the values of which that church or that synagogue or that place of worship is connected to. You have to stand up for your values and not be afraid, Steve, for someone to criticize you, is to stand up for those values and say, listen, this is who I am. This is what I believe in. This is why this country's great.
Dr. Paul and then Representative Bachmann.
You know, I think it's wrong to assume that if you legalize liberty and freedom, that because somebody might do something wrong, you don't want to legalize it. Liberty doesn't mean libertine. It means you have choices, but you suffer the consequences. It does not mean endorsement. When you legalize freedom of choice, think about it in a religious sense. We legalize, and we do a pretty good job in this country on the First Amendment. We legalize our freedom of choice in our religious value. But in this country, you're even allowed to be an atheist. But if you say, well, there's the danger of being atheist, so we can't legalize freedom of choice in religion, or we can't legalize freedom. Maybe somebody will want too many homeschoolers. So no, you want to legalize liberty. You don't want to designate what your beliefs are going to be, because somebody might abuse it and they have to assume the responsibility for making the mistakes. But because somebody might make a bad choice, you don't say give up on liberty. This is what the liberals do when they come to economics. Somebody might not make a good choice. They might not take care of themselves. They might not save for them for their retirement. So therefore, we have to be the protector. We have to protect the people from themselves. So I think overall, the defense of liberty is really what we need in this country, because we're losing it, unfortunately.
Representative Bachmann.
I think probably the greatest amount of censorship in this country today is in the pulpits of our churches, because we have a law that limits pastors for what they can say about politics in the pulpit. That's not the American way. I have a book at home, actually it's a 2-volume series of election sermons that pastors used to give in the pulpits, because they felt free to talk about elections, free to talk about issues, free to talk about politics if they want to. That is the First Amendment. allowing pastors to say whatever they want to say in the pulpit. Because one thing they recognize is the whole concept of American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism is grounded on the Judeo-Christian ethic, which is really based upon the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were the foundation for our law. That's what Blackstone said, the English jurist, and our founders looked to Blackstone for the foundation of our law. That's our law. American exceptionalism was built on that. And if we silence the pastors in the pulpits because of a law that Lyndon Johnson put into effect back in the 1950s because he didn't want them to say something against him, what I would do is back the repeal of that law so that we can exercise First Amendment rights again everywhere, including in this church and every pulpit.
Let me ask you. I know we need to move on, and clearly the audience responded well to that. But you would be authorizing pastors to stand up and speak against the things that you believe in.
Of course.
That's
liberty.
And you don't have a problem with the religious community standing up and espousing the liberalism that so many of you reject. That's not an issue for anybody here?
They do already. Frank, it happens already. It happens already. It's just our values that tend to get silenced in the pulpit.
Go ahead, last comment.
But you see, if they go to that liberal extreme from the pulpit, the members have a choice. Go to another church that represents your values. Pick another church. And one other thing I wanted to pick up on what Representative Bachman was saying in terms of why are pastors not as open in talking about these liberties. It gets back to this intimidation factor. And the main thing that intimidates pastors, not all, because some of them are very courageous, to talk about the values, to talk about the issues, to talk about solutions without necessarily making it partisan. Many of them are intimidated for one simple reason. The tax code and the IRS is what causes many of them to take the easy way out. That drives a lot of the intimidation.
And that's what
this is open to anybody. You all talk about freedom, and you all talk about morality in your campaign speeches. There's less conversation about personal responsibility. And I linked the three. And I would ask any of you, and I'd actually like to hear from all of you, what is your worldview? And speak of it in terms of freedom, responsibility, and morality.
I talk about it a whole lot because I talk about freedom a lot and I talk about responsibility. And I tell young people, and I talk to a lot of young people, that if we can get a free society today and get you out into a position where you don't have to endorse government medicine and government education and you can opt out of Social Security, I says, one thing is, if you get your freedom, you have to accept the responsibility. You can't, if you fail in taking care of yourself, if you want your freedom to do that and you don't do well, you don't have a right to go to your neighbor directly, and you don't have a right to go to your government and say, go to my neighbor and take care of me because I didn't meet up with my responsibilities. They have to face the consequences.
Next.
I have a biblical worldview, and I think going back to the Declaration of Independence, the fact that it's God who created us. If he created us, he created government, and the government is on his shoulders, as the book of Isaiah says. He created every aspect of life, and he has something to say about every aspect of life. So my view of the world is a biblical worldview where I want to see what he has to say about it, because he wrote the owner's manual, so to speak. He has a lot to say about marriage, family, children. Now, people may choose not to go along with a biblical worldview. I do.
Freedom without responsibility is immoral. That's how they're related. Freedom without responsibility is immoral. Go back to the Declaration: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those unalienable rights. You can have all of the pursuit of happiness that you want, As long as you don't infringe upon someone else's liberty. You can have all the liberties this nation offers if you don't infringe upon someone else's life, and that includes the life of the unborn.
Yeah. Governor?
Frank, I want to take this and go in a couple of directions with it. When you talk about freedom, morality, and responsibility, our founding fathers, when you go back and read some of the documentation, whether it was Madison or whether it was Jefferson, and they had a very narrow view about the Constitution and its impact upon the people of this country, the common welfare, if you will, of this country. And to take that step about freedom and morality and responsibility into the 10th Amendment. And that's one of the reasons that I'm such a strong proponent of getting Washington, D.C. out of the state's business when it comes to education, when it comes to health care. It's one of the reasons that Obamacare has to go, because it's trying to tell us how to deliver health care in our states. And I'll promise you, governors and legislators know how to do that substantially better, and to allow us the freedom to have the responsibility to morally take care of our citizens. And in a more global sense, in the last debate I talked about that our foreign policy budgets need to start at zero for every country out there. Nobody.
Including Israel.
Including Israel. I can promise you there will be plenty of folks that support our foreign aid to Israel. Israel will get its foreign aid, but it starts at zero just like anybody else. But the idea that we are sending billions of dollars to China, who are aborting 35,000 children a day, is immoral and wrong and has to stop.
Well, I would say I would agree with at least three of the folks here on the issue of what freedom and responsibility mean. I talk a lot, I talked in my book about the concept of no-fault freedom, which is what I see the left is all about, freedom without responsibility. If you look at no-fault marriage, look at all these no faults, you can do whatever you want to do. Look at the popular culture and this whole idea that, if you just do it, just if it feels good. The whole sexual revolution, the same thing. Just don't think about the consequences of your actions. Just do what feels like what you feel like you need to do. And that is not our founders' vision. That is, as Newt suggests, license, liberty, and it's a corruption of liberty. It's not an understanding of liberty. Our founders understood liberty is, not what you want to do, but what you ought to do. That's what liberty really is about. It's an informed understanding of what, again, as I talked about earlier, God gave us rights, but he also gave us laws upon which to exercise those rights. And that's what you ought to do. And by the way, the law should comport. The laws of this country should comport with that moral vision. Why? Because the law is a teacher. If something is illegal in this country because it is immoral and it is wrong and it is harmful to society, saying that it is illegal and putting a law in place teaches. It's not just, laws cannot be neutral. There is no neutral, Ron. There is only moral and immoral, and the law has to reflect what is right and good and just for our society.
So there's an absolute right and wrong.
There is, yeah.
Absolutely.
Of course there's an absolute right and wrong, and we've always understood that to be the case, but that is one of the seminal battles in this country, which is truth and whether there is truth.
Speaker Gingrich.
Well, Jefferson said that people who want to be both free and ignorant are asking for something which has never been and will never be. Captain John Smith said in 1607 in the first English-speaking permanent colony to the aristocrats who had paid their way and didn't want to work, if you don't work, you won't eat. There was a deep sense of responsibility. Now, let me now take that and for a brief moment describe Occupy Wall Street. All of the Occupy movement starts with the premise that we all owe them everything. They take over a public park they didn't pay for, to go nearby to use bathrooms they didn't pay for, to beg for food from places that they don't want to pay for, to obstruct those who are going to work to pay the taxes to sustain the bathrooms and to sustain the park, so that they can self-righteously explain that they are the paragons of virtue to which we owe everything. Now, that is a pretty good symptom of how much the left has collapsed as a moral system in this country, and why you need to reassert something as simple as saying to them, go get a job right after you take a bath.
Do you really want to follow that? Mr. Kane, there's a certain rule in entertainment, which is never follow a great applause line.
And I cannot top that one. But he, Speaker Gingrich, just gave a perfect illustration, of the statement I made earlier. Very good. Perfect illustration on Wall Street. Freedom without responsibility is what that represented, which leads me to conclude it was immoral what they did. Freedom without responsibility is immoral. And that's what they were doing on Wall Street.
In a moment, I will turn to my colleagues to ask several questions, but before I do, Abraham Lincoln once said that the states do not have the right to do wrong, and you raised this in terms of the 10th Amendment. The states do not have the right to do wrong. All of you have talked about the 10th Amendment. It's actually an area where some of you do disagree on. If the governors had the right to tell Washington no, you're from Georgia, that would have had serious consequences on your youth. I've read your background. Do governors in the states on issues of morality have the right to tell Washington no?
If it's wrong,
who decides?
Go back to these founding principles. Go back to these founding values. Let me explain. When the founders conceived the Declaration of Independence, and they wrote those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They set the bar high. They didn't set it where they were. They set the bar high, hoping that this nation would aspire up to that level, and that's the journey we have been on since the beginning of this nation.
But you know that all men at that time were not created equal.
Correctly. They should have been, no, they were recognizing that all men are created equal. All men, that was the statement, the aspirational statement that the founders put there.
And there were still some men who were not worth the same as other men. And we had that same problem in the 1950s and 60s.
That was a man-made description of some were not created equal. But what I'm saying is that the founders set the bar up here so we could work up to that. It took us a long time to get up to that point, but we got there. Remember, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in the South. I saw the separate water fountains. It wasn't right. It didn't feel right. And eventually we got past that with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Because Washington told your state that it couldn't behave that way.
Because they were behaving wrong. Gets back to the states can't say no to the federal government if they are wrong.
When does Washington, and Governor, you're next, when does...
No, the states definitely have a right to be wrong, and the states are supposed to correct it. But there are limits, and that's why we have a Constitution. But the Constitution doesn't give license to the federal government. I mean, the federal government has taken license, and they're too much involved, but the Constitution is a restriction on the federal government. It's not a restriction on the states, and it's not a restriction on personal liberties. So therefore, what we must do is obey the law. Slavery and civil liberties, I mean, there's quite a few things, but not most things were left to the states. Monetary issue was left to the federal government. Defense was left to the federal government. But most, like education, why in the world have we ever drifted to the point where we allow this casualness to ignore the Constitution and say it's a federal function? We don't need the Department of Education. We need those things taken care of at the state level.
Governor.
And the Energy Department, too.
There you go.
Governor, is there a third area you want to cut?
You know, let me just kind of take off on the question that you asked on the 10th Amendment. I wrote a book, Fed Up, that really focused on it. And by the way, Newt, thank you for writing a very intuitive and spot-on prologue in that book. But the issue about our Constitution is this, that it can be amended. And we have a process in place to amend the Constitution of the United States. And I would suggest most of the individuals sitting around this table understand that there are some issues out there that are so important, moral issues, social issues, that are so important that you can, in fact, amend our Constitution of the United States. I think that we've had enough discussions and debates about a human life amendment to protect human life in this country.
But should the states be able to say no to Washington?
When you pass a constitutional amendment, no. There are limits to what a state can say no to. And that is, I agree with Congressman Paul in the sense of that's what the Constitution of the United States is there for. It should be hard to amend it. It should be hard to change it. But when you look at issues like traditional marriage, when you look at issues like the Human Life Amendment, a president of the United States can lead on those issues, can publicly proclaim support and go campaign all across this country to get those states to support those positions so that you can change the Constitution. And that is the virtuous direction that the next president of the United States needs to powerfully go down.
Very quickly.
Very quickly. Let's take a current example, the health care mandate. Many of us believe that the federal government does not have the right to mandate that people buy health insurance. Some states are saying no. The courts are going to decide, but that's an example of when the states can say no if, in fact, we, the states, and the people believe it's wrong.
If only Mitt Romney were here to respond.
Mitt who?
Frank, can I just respond to that?
Very quickly, because I have to
with Obamacare, the states can say no, but the problem with Obamacare is Obamacare will trump the states. So that's why at the federal level, as President of the United States, I'm going to lead that effort to repeal Obamacare. That's why I wrote the legislation to repeal, because the federal legislation trumps the states. That's the problem.
Senator.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a very strong supporter of the 10th Amendment. The federal government should not be in education. It should be in health care, a whole lot of other areas. But the idea that the only things that the states are prevented from doing are only things specifically established in the Constitution is wrong. Our country is based on a moral enterprise. Gay marriage is wrong. As Abraham Lincoln said, the states do not have the right to do wrong. And so there are folks here who said that states can do this and I won't get involved in that. I will get involved in that because states, as a president, I will get involved because the states do not have the right to undermine the basic fundamental values that hold this country together. America is an ideal. It's not just a constitution, it is an ideal. It is a set of morals and principles that were established in that declaration. And states don't have the right, just like they didn't have the rights to do slavery. Why? Because it was a morally reprehensible and wrong thing. And so as a result, the president has an obligation to go out and work in those states, not just for a federal marriage amendment, which I'm for, But in those states, I'm the only one on this stage who came to Iowa last year and worked to defeat those justices. I stood up because it was important to do that.
I would like to turn it over to my colleagues for a separate set of questions.
Yeah, I'm Tom Minery with Citizen Link, which is the policy arm of Focus on the Family. We invited you all to dress as you would have dressed at Thanksgiving dinner. And
pretty formal dinner.
Yeah, right.
Then we invited you to a church. Most of you look like you're dressed for church. You look wonderful.
I didn't get the memo.
Yeah.
Let me pursue that question on abortion. Let me start with Mr. Kaine, and anyone else can jump in if you'd like. Mr. Kaine, when you are president, it is possible that Roe v. Wade will be overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, when that happens, the problem of abortion will be returned to the states. Will you indeed pursue a federal law banning abortion or a federal constitutional amendment banning abortion once and for all?
If that legislation gets to my desk, I will absolutely sign it. And yes to the second part of your question.
Now, by saying that the legislation has to get to your desk, that belies the sense that you're really going to push Congress hard to get it to your desk. Will you push hard to get it to your desk, or will you simply sign it if it gets there?
With all due respect, there are a lot of things that the president, that I would push hard to do, and yes, that would be one of them because I think that it should be overturned. So it wasn't to imply that I wouldn't heavily promote it and push it, but yes, it would be something that I would support and I would sign it. I think the main thing, the president can help promote, can push and pull, yes, but we got to have that inertia coming from the Congress. So I'm clear about, yes, I will sign it, and yes, I will help promote it.
Thank you. Speaker Gingrich, would you care to weigh in on that?
Well, I'm intrigued with something which Robbie George of Princeton has come up with, which is an interpretation of the 14th Amendment in which it says that Congress shall define personhood. That's very clearly in the 14th Amendment. And part of what I would like to explore is whether or not you could get the Congress to pass a law which simply says personhood begins at conception. And therefore, and you could in the same law block the court and just say this will not be subject to review, which we have precedent for. You would therefore not have to have a constitutional amendment because the Congress would have exercised its authority under the 14th Amendment to define life and to therefore undo all of Roe versus Wade for the entire country in one legislative action.
I'll move on unless someone else would like to weigh in on that. Dr. Paul.
On the same subject, same
Yes.
question. On that, I have supported the amendment that defines life at conception, and I think that's important. But I don't endorse the idea that the enforcement should come from the federal government. We don't need another police force in Washington. We already have 100,000 bureaucrats running around with guns, so we don't need more enforcement. All acts of violence under our Constitution, like murder and injury and robbery, that's not a federal offense, it's a state offense, and laws do vary. So I would not want to repeal that provision. It was meant that it would be handled at the states. And we have to remember, when we tend to nationalize things, we expose ourselves to great danger, because when they make a mistake, it's national. This is the reason that we had Roe versus Wade. They should have never heard that case. They nationalized it. So I'm very cautious about nationalizing these laws. So it would be much better to state when life begins, make the law enforcement at the state level, which has been traditional. But it should not be that we enforce this law at the national level, but there's no reason why we can't define when life begins.
But if they nationalize the problem, why is it wrong to nationalize the solution?
Well, and I would be glad to do that. And the solution, it would have been solved 10 years ago, because I've been pushing a law that could have been passed by majority vote when we had the House and the Senate and the presidency. If we would have been determined, we could have repealed Roe versus Wade by passing the law called the We the People Act. It removes the jurisdictions from the federal court. So you remove this jurisdiction, which is a constitutional authority. That could have been done 10 years ago. We could have continued to work on the amendment. We could have continued to change the courts. But if we would have passed that by majority vote, we would have saved millions of lives, and we have not had the support from the Right to Life community to at least do that, and I do not understand why that is the case, because we would have accomplished that in a short period of time and would have not distracted from the national solution of amending the Constitution and changing our Supreme Court.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Bachmann, just quickly, and then I'll move on to my other question.
Well, I think it's clear. Every human being is made in the image and likeness of a holy God, and every human being deserves and needs that protection from our federal government. I will stand for whether it's Robbie George's legislation or the one that Dr. Paul is talking about, or whether it's a human life amendment. I will stand for it. But one thing that everyone has to recognize tonight in this room is that today, we have, for the first time in the history of our country, taxpayer-subsidized abortion because of Obamacare. And the new playground of the left is in Obamacare, because Planned Parenthood has just been given full lease in our public schools. And Planned Parenthood now will be pushing chemical abortion and billing that to the federal government under preventive care. We're in a whole new universe today than we've ever even comprehended because of Obamacare. And that's why this is the one election and the only chance that we have to repeal Obamacare. If we don't, forever, we will have taxpayer-subsidized abortion, and those of us who believe in these moral issues, we have already lost every single one of these battles, because the chips have already been put on the side of the left in Obamacare. They've won. That's why this is the issue, and we have to have a candidate, and I am, who is committed to the full-scale repeal of Obamacare. We can't get it wrong.
Thank you very much. My last question, and we'll start with Governor Perry, if you would. The question is this. There are many adoption agencies around the country that are faith-based. They are being run out of business because they will only place children in homes headed by mothers and fathers, and they will not place those children in homes headed by same-sex couples. Is this a federal problem? And if it is, what, as president, would you do about it?
Well, obviously, I think it is an issue that you can address at the federal level, and passing a federal marriage amendment is one of the ways to do that. But until that does pass, as in the state of Texas, a gay couple cannot adopt a child in the state of Texas. So the states have the ability, again, until there is a federal marriage amendment that clearly states that marriage is between one man and one woman, and in that as well, you cannot adopt a child unless it is one man and one woman.
Thank you. Senator.
This goes to the point that I was making before, which is we can't wait for a federal marriage amendment. We've got to go out into the states. Every time there's been a debate on marriage in this country, where there's been a referendum, 32 times, it's 32-0. And almost every one of those states where it started, the marriage was going to, traditional marriage was going to fail. And the reason we were able to succeed is because we had the debate. There's no way gay marriage would have ever passed in the state of Iowa. There's no way it would pass anywhere, even in places where, like California and Maine. The reason it doesn't is because people don't realize the dramatic consequences. Not just, people think, well, it's just a person we might know or a friend or a relative, and we don't want to offend them. But the dramatic consequences to faith, to family, to our education system, it radically changes the entire moral fabric of our country. And when people realize that, then it loses. And that's why, as president, you have to go out into each state and you have to rally and get the debate started. Because once the debate is started, then you're not going to have to worry about gay adoption. That's the difference between me and everybody else out here. I'm willing and have been. I've led, not just on this issue. And we talk about the issue of abortion. I'm not going to, you make the assumption that we're going to pass the Supreme Court's going to overturn Roe versus Wade. I'm not going to wait for that. I'm going to be out and talking about the culture of life. I'm going to be talking about how valuable it is for our society to honor everyone. And I will live it in my own life as we have with our family.
Okay. The question is not so much about marriage, and gay adoption is legal in many jurisdictions today. The question is, if indeed it continues to be legal, should faith-based adoption agencies have the freedom to place children in homes headed by a mother and a father in accord with their sincerely held religious beliefs or not?
Absolutely.
One more person.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But if there is no gay marriage,
yes,
it's
last
going to
comment.
happen very hard.
I think this is very important. I mean, if you look at the history from the mid-1960s, we've gone from a request for toleration to an imposition of intolerance. We've gone from a request to understand others to a determination to close down those who hold traditional values. And it strikes me at a number of levels. First, that on the opening day, there will be I would have an executive order to reinstate George W. Bush's conscience clause and to extend it to adoption agencies and other religious services. Second, I would encourage a bill to cut off all federal funds to any jurisdiction, state or local, which in fact discriminates against religious beliefs in that format. And third, I think that we need to be very aggressive and very direct. The degree to which the left is prepared to impose intolerance and to drive out of existence traditional religion is a mortal threat to our civilization and deserves to be taken head on and described as what it is, which is the use of government to repress the American people against their own values.
Thank you all very much.
In a moment, we will take a brief break. But before we do, I don't want to leave this issue of government morality and the Constitution. Governor Perry, you've suggested term limits for Supreme Court justices as a way to address this. I'm just curious from the audience, in terms of applause, how many of you would support term limits for Supreme Court justices?
So how many of you would support a part-time legislature and a part-time Congress? Sorry, just had to ask you. While we're asking.
Governor, I'll let you be a pollster if you'll
Yes,
let me
sir.
be governor of Texas.
One day. Governor for a day.
I'll take you up on that.
All right.
That is frightening. That's the most frightening comment this evening.
See, actually, I know these 6 people up here. I've known them for some time. Let me ask each of you, because you've spoken about the judiciary and you've spoken about the constitutionality. Other than that, are there any specific changes that you would make to the courts, the court system, the judges, the justices, that would reinstill these values that you speak of?
Well, I think I would go from what Dr. Paul said. I think that Congress has been remiss to not limit subject matter jurisdiction. Congress does have the ability to abolish courts if they want to, or to limit subject matter jurisdiction. In other words, what that means is Congress has the right to limit what cases that courts can take up. And I think that's something that Congress should do on some of these issues where the courts decide, they think it's okay for Congress to decide load limits on terminate trucks, for instance, but they think they should be deciding the definition of marriage or when life begins. And I think that's an instance where we can limit subject matter jurisdiction. Something else that would be very helpful in the area of energy. This is something I've worked on for 4 years, American energy independence. And one thing that could be done, almost every offshore oil lease immediately has a lawsuit filed against it by radical environmental groups the second that that lease comes available. We can limit those lawsuits, and I think that's something we need to do because every family and every business is impacted by high energy prices, and we need to open up and expand American energy production and get back to what gasoline was the day that Barack Obama took office, $1.79 a gallon, and we can do that again.
Speaker Gingrich.
I published a paper at new.org on judicial reform, which is probably the boldest statement since Lincoln's first inaugural took on the Supreme Court over the Dred Scott decision. And Lincoln said that for 9 people to be able to define the law would end freedom in the United States. So he had a fairly firm view of this. The simplest first step, which I would take, is to propose, and I hope this will be a significant part of the campaign next year, I propose to abolish the court of Judge Baer in San Antonio, who on June 1st issued an order that said not only could students not pray at their graduation, they couldn't use the word benediction, they could not say the word prayer, they could not say the word God, they could not ask people to stand for a moment of silence, and they couldn't use the word invocation. And if they broke any of those, he would put their superintendent in jail. I regard that as such a ruthlessly anti-American statement that he should not be on the court, and I would move to literally abolish his court so that he could go back to private practice as a signal to the courts.
Senator Santorum, a final comment before we go to our break.
I agree with a lot of what is just being said here. I would go farther, one step farther, Newt. I would abolish the entire Ninth Circuit, which is something within the opportunity of this country. And the idea that the third branch of government, Article 3 of the Constitution, which we know was the least important because it's third, not first or second, that they would be seen as the superior branch of government that could be literally unchecked is something that our founders absolutely would be appalled by. Here's the difference between me and everybody else here. I've actually done something to push it back. I didn't just propose things or just don't have ideas. When I was in the United States Senate, the Supreme Court struck down the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. When George Bush became president and we had the votes to pass it, I stood up and went with the House Judiciary Committee, and we got a bill together and said, they're wrong. And we passed an almost identical bill, and the first 2 sections of the bill said why the Supreme Court was wrong and that we have an equal right to determine what's constitutional as an independent and equal branch of government. We passed it, President Bush signed it, and the Supreme Court reversed themselves. That is a track record of standing up for the court, not just a plan of standing up for the court.
When we come back, I will raise the issue of your own personal strengths. I will ask if there's anything that you all would seek forgiveness being in this sanctuary. And I will ask you about those things in your life that have affected why you believe what you believe. If everyone could stay seated, we will take a 5-minute break. In the process of doing the research behind all of this, I discovered some stories about you all that are very impressive. And these are stories that are not often told. And I do not wish to embarrass anyone here, but I think it would be to your benefit to offer to the people in this sanctuary a specific challenge, either in your childhood or in your adulthood, that shaped your view of life and had an impact on your faith, your spirituality, and your public life. And I'll allow anyone, this is not a required question, but if there ever was a place to bare your soul, this is.
It won't be pretty.
Now, that wasn't even meant as a humorous line. This is the place to do it.
I'll start. I became a Christian officially at the age of 10 when I joined the church, Antioch Baptist Church North in Atlanta, Georgia. And as most Christians, your faith grows with your life experiences, and so did mine. But the most challenging experience in which I had to dig deep with respect to my faith was when I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. It was bigger than a 2x4 up against the head, spiritually, physically, and everything else. And I will never forget that after my wife and I, my wife, Gloria, of 43 years, she happens to be with me here tonight, of 43 years, I will never forget walking out of
I will come back to you because I want to hear this story.
Let me try.
Yeah.
Walking out of that surgeon's office after she had just told us stage 4.
Take your time.
I said I wasn't going to do this. Is as bad as it gets. I will never forget, before my wife and I were about to get in the car, I said, I can do this. She said, we can do this.
Amen. Frank, growing up in Paint Creek, Texas, I think the idea that I'm sitting at this table with these incredibly capable and good and great public servants is kind of a story of itself, just to share with people about growing up the 16 miles away from a place that had the closest post office, and going to that little school with about 110 kids, and I think there were 13 in my graduating class, and any of you that are interested, I graduated in the top 10 class, by the way. For the record. For the record. But it was all about, I mean, it was going to school, it was going to Boy Scouts, and it was being involved in 4-H. I mean, that was my life, and it was a very small and compact, and the man who had probably as much influence on my life as anyone was my scoutmaster, who was also the Sunday school superintendent, who was also the president of the school board. And he influenced me every day. He's the reason I ended up going to the beloved Texas A&M. He was an Aggie, and he proselyted us to go to school there. But it was such a, the idea that we live in this great country, and that this boy who grew up in a house with no indoor plumbing, and mom sewed my underwear and washed me in a No. 2 wash tub, could be sitting here, is just it's a stunning story of America. And the powerfulness of it is that it was that community who daily, not just me, but the other young people, who they took them through their faith walk. At that, we had a Methodist church and a Baptist church across the Farnham Market Road from Paint Creek School. Your choice. And that was it. But they took us on this faith walk. And in the summer of 1964, when I gave my life to Jesus Christ, but the story didn't end there, because I went off to college and I went off to the Air Force, and frankly, I was too busy for God. As I finished my tour as a pilot in the Air Force and I moved back home, and I was lost. And I couldn't understand why that I was not happy. I couldn't understand what it was that was missing out of my life. But in every person's heart, in every person's soul, there is a hole that can only be filled by the Lord Jesus Christ. As a 27-year-old young man, that's when I truly gave my life to Christ. And it has made every day worth living. Because I know that you wanted to ask about, for anything I want to be talking about forgiveness in this great sanctuary. But the great news for us Christians is that we've been forgiven for them. Amen.
Dr. Paul.
I was born and raised in Pennsylvania in a family of 5 boys during the Depression, so I remember the tail end of the Depression and World War II, and they weren't such great economic times. But our family was oriented around the church. It was oriented around our family life, a lot of hard work and a work ethic. And the work ethic taught us all at a very young age that you worked and you were rewarded for this. But the important things in the church life for me came as a Lutheran, making a decision to go through catechism, which is somewhat different than others. So that catechism and making the decision to join the church, as well as being exposed to a couple of crusades by Billy Graham's, was the time when I made my commitment to Christ, and it was a very important period in my life. But you said we exempt, our wives and our children because they are so important and they are at the top of our list. But there was something that was given to me in many ways I earned because of something I wanted to do, and that was going through medical school. And finally getting through the military and all my training, but going into medical practice was really astounding because to me, it was the assumption that people will come to me in trust, and that I took very, very seriously. And although I didn't have a personal experience like Herman had for medical illness, I got to share those experiences, and I'm sure your doctors were very important. So I got to share that with new life coming into the world. There's nothing more marvelous in medicine than sharing new life and having delivered thousands of babies. And this is a very joyous profession. But then there was something else that happened that I feel very blessed with, because I had an inquisitive mind and I wanted to know how the world worked and how the economy worked and why we had recessions and depressions. So I was fascinated not with fishing and hunting. I got fascinated with reading economics. And then I thought speaking out would be a lot of fun, but it led to a little bit of involvement in a political life. I feel very lucky that I am blessed that I've been able to practice medicine, have my family, and also participate in public life, and I'm very thankful.
I'm curious. Are you prouder that you are a duly elected member of Congress, or are you prouder of your medical profession?
Oh, the medical profession by far, doctors are still rated a lot higher in the polling than the politicians.
It's probably because they had the wrong pollster taking the survey. Representative Bachman.
I just want to say how grateful I am and thankful I am for my parents, and I honor them. And I was born and raised here in Waterloo and Cedar Falls, Iowa. And then when I was about 12, my dad got a job up in Honeywell in Minnesota. We moved up there, and we were there a year or so, and something happened that hadn't happened in our family before. My parents got a divorce, and we'd never had an experience with that. And when that happened, almost my dad left, and I didn't see him again for 6 years. And when that happened, we lost virtually everything overnight. We lost our home, and I remember my mom took all the things out of the pretty dishes out of the dining room and the wedding gifts and everything, and she put it on card tables out in the garage, and we just watched everything sold and sent away. And my mom said to us, She said, it's hard now, but she said, we're going to hold on. We're going to get through this. We're going to be okay. And it really was hard. She'd never worked outside the home. She'd been a wonderful homemaker, but she was all of a sudden a single mom. It was my 3 brothers and myself, and we all had to get jobs. She made $4,800 a year. And so I got a job babysitting. I made 50 cents an hour. I had to buy my own glasses. I had to buy my own jackets and lunch at school. She did everything that she could. There just wasn't enough. And my brothers did the same thing. But it is amazing to me how God uses those challenges to really shape your life. And it taught me the value of a dollar, and that necessity is the mother of invention, and that no one owes me a living, and an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, and that your work is your bond. All those enervating, animating principles that really are the basis of the country, that's what I learned. But it also gave me a broken heart for at-risk kids. So after my husband and I were married, we started taking in foster children. We took 23 children in over the years, and we raised these foster children in addition to our 5 and launched them. And I got involved in politics because of these foster kids. We had homeschooled and put our biological kids in private Christian school, but the state of Minnesota said there's only one option for foster kids. It's public school. And I was nervous about what I saw coming home in the backpack. It was dumbed down political correctness. So I got involved. And I ended up giving 5 years of my life to education reform. I traveled all over the state of Minnesota, not exactly a conservative bastion. All I have to say is Senator Al Franken, and you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a very different environment up there. But over a 5-year period, I brought people together, Democrats, Republicans, independents. We did what no other state did. We threw out a federal government takeover of our public schools with Goals 2000 and School to Work, and instead we replaced it with high academic standards. And I saw that it is possible to fight City Hall, and that's why when I went to Congress, I was a part of a movement to bring 40,000 more Americans in to fight Obamacare, because again, some issues are so much bigger than politics. And that's what I think we're going to see in this next presidential election. This election is bigger than Republican, Democrat, and Independent. This is going to be the whole country coming together to save America. And that's what I'm excited about.
Senator. You don't have to.
No, this is, I thought about trying to fulfill your obligation of some confession, and
no, that's coming up next.
And I was the author of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act, and remember being on the floor many, many nights talking about all of these children who were disabled, who were the target of partial birth abortions. Children who were found late in pregnancy to have a problem, and mothers wanted to have a late-term abortion. And I would go on for hours and hours and hours and talk about the courage that parents would have to fight just so their children could be born. After I left the United States Senate, Karen and I were blessed with another child. We had been trying for a long time. Now, I know with 6 children, you think you're trying for a long time after 6 children. We had. And we discovered joyfully that we were expecting another child. Right toward the end of the pregnancy, we found that there might be some problems. So, long story short, Karen had delivered our baby, Isabella Maria, early. They immediately took her to the ICU and did some testing. 4 or 5 days later, they told us that she had a fatal condition. Was going to die. She had a condition called trisomy 18, which is like Down syndrome. Trisomy 21 is Down syndrome. It's trisomy 18, which is far worse. They said she's lucky to be alive, only a 10% survival rate at birth. And of the children that survive, 90% die in the first year, most in the first few weeks or months. Well, we decided to do everything we could. She was our daughter. We were going to help her. And she did well. She sailed through the NICU, and after 10 days, we decided there's nothing more they could do for us, so we took her home. I'll never forget, the pediatrician is doing the exit interview with us. kept saying to us, you realize your child's going to die. And they say, we have the internet. Yes, we know all about this disorder. And she talked about how there would probably be a lung problem. She would probably die because of respiratory failure. And so Karen suggested that we should maybe have a prescription for oxygen if she needed some help. The doctor looked at her and said, "You have to learn to let go." I said, "All we're asking for is oxygen." And he said the same thing to me. Well, then Mama Bear stood up. And so after we got the prescription for oxygen, we left and went home. We went home on hospice care. Little Bella did amazingly well for the first few months, but then she got a cold. She got sick, and that's a killer for children like this. And it was for her in the sense that she quickly went downhill, and before we knew it, her heart had stopped. She had stopped breathing. Karen was able to do CPR. We got the EMTs and got her to the emergency room. She did okay. She came back, but then a couple months later, she had the same thing happen. And this time I was home holding her when it happened. I'll never forget seeing her fail and not being able to breathe. We had a monitor on her. She finally stopped breathing, and I put her on the bed, and I tried to do everything I could to try to get her to start breathing again. The next thing I know, Karen comes knocking me out of the way with an ambu bag and does CPR, and she comes back again. We went to the hospital and with the emergency room. And there she is laying on the table. She's about 5 months old. And she has her hand out on the emergency room gurney. And I went over and I reached out and held her finger. For the 5 months leading up to this, I had been the rock in the house. I was the guy that held everything together. Karen would always ask, "How can you be so?" I said, "Well, this is how I deal with things." And it was a lie. It was a lie. I decided that the best thing I could do was to treat her differently, to not love her like I did, because it wouldn't hurt as much if I lost her. I remember holding that finger, looking at her, and realizing what I'd done. I had been exactly what I had said that I had fought against at the partial birth abortion. I had seen her as less of a person because of her disability. And I prayed that moment, please, please let her live. I promise. I'll do everything to commit to her, and not just her, but to every child like her. She made it. I remember walking out of the emergency room and I got a phone call from my 13-year-old daughter. Now, she was 10 at the time. And she said, "Is Bella all right?" I said, "She's doing fine. She's hanging in there." She said, "Dad, Mama saved Bella's life." I said, "Yeah, I know." And she said, "Dad, you didn't do anything." I said, "You'll find that to be pretty much the case with mothers and fathers." And so one of the reasons I'm here tonight is because, as Michelle vehemently talks about, is Obamacare. We've gotten involved in the world of special needs. Bob and Darla can tell you all about it, and I'm sure you know. And it's a different world. And it's a world with socialized medicine where children like Bella and Bob and Darla's son and others that I'm sure are in this room do not get the care that they need. And I will fight to make sure that happens. I will honor Bella.
Do you want to answer this? Do you want to go on?
She's now 3.5 years of age. And the reason she's not here, she's not doing well tonight, but so Mom is home with, my wife's not here because she's not doing well tonight. So please say a little prayer for her, but she's hanging in there. Thank you.
Let me actually, for a second, break out of your question and build on what Rick just said, which is so powerful. We have a mutual friend who had a son who was born, and within hours they discovered that he had a very, very rare heart problem. And there were only like 3 people in the country who could solve it. And they literally had to go that night. He had like 24 hours as a brand new baby. They went to the first doctor and decided they didn't really trust him because he had exactly the attitude you were talking about, which is, well, we can try, but they almost never survive. And so then jumped in a car, ran to New York City to the second of the 3 people who can do this particular operation. Decided they liked the guy, they trusted him. They had the operation. And the doctor came out and said, well, in preparing for the operation is successful, and I think we're going to be able to fix your son's heart. However, in the process of doing that, we discovered he has brain tumors. They then went through 6 years at Johns Hopkins of, at appropriate moments, taking out each of the tumors. They weren't cancerous, they were just tumors that were going to kill him. And so this little boy, he's a very close friend, he spent 6 years with a shunt in the back of his head. And he spent 6 years knowing that in a couple months I'll go back, I'll go through another operation. They finally, in the 6th year, went back, and the doctor's fussing around, and the little kid looks up and says, look, can we just get this over with so I can get this shunt out so I can go play football? Now, he today has a good heart, a good brain, is good at baseball and football. He was the assistant director of one of my movies. We have a great outtake of him saying, why can't he learn his lines? And you look at that, and I just want to build on what Rick was saying. You look at that and you say to yourself, all right, do I want some bureaucracy deciding that on a percentage basis this is not worth the investment? Or do I want a country that cares about every life at that depth? That is what next year is all about.
And if I can take the moderator's prerogative to listen to the stories of you and the challenges that you all have faced and what you have survived. It's strange to me to see in some of these debates why you have gone at each other when you have so much to contribute and you have achieved so much and you're so admirable in terms of character. I would hope this may get me fired, truthfully. But I would hope that you would realize that you have more that you agree on than those small things that you disagree on. And that you carry yourselves this way through the rest of the campaign. You always stand up and tell people what you succeeded, what you believe in. Again, through this research, I know that some of you have had significant failures in life. And we all know that you probably learn more from what doesn't go right than what does. Could I ask several of you to identify something in your career or your personal life that didn't work out, that didn't reach the standard that you might have had, and how that informed you and how that will make you a better president in 2013?
I'll be glad to start this then. I was born, a little bit like Dr. Paul, I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And when I was about 2, my mother divorced and remarried a couple years later. And I was born in McPherson. I was adopted and became McGingrich, my stepfather's name. And in that period, my mother was working, and I had a grandmother who really raised me and spent a lot of the time raising me. And she was a very old-fashioned, very deeply religious person. And so between the time I was 2 and about 5, she worked very hard to make sure I understood that there was heaven and hell, and that one was preferable and the other wasn't. And she was fairly vivid in explaining the concept. And I went through a relatively complex life because my dad was a career soldier. So I grew up originally in Pennsylvania in the Lutheran church and sang in the boys' choir and did the things you do in a small town. Then became, for example, a Presbyterian acolyte at one point, because you basically became whatever the Protestant chaplain was as you moved around the world. And I would have said that I was a pretty religious person. It had been driven very deeply by my grandmother. And after I got married and things became more complicated, we had 2 wonderful daughters. Although I was remarkably successful in many ways, I was a PhD, I was a congressman, had a lot of very exciting things going on, there was a part of me that was truly hollow. And it was almost like the harder I worked and the more things I did, the hollower I got inside. And finally, a friend of mine who was a banker in Griffin, Georgia, actually gave me the 2 books that are the base of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I wasn't drinking, but I had precisely the symptoms of somebody who was collapsing under this weight. And I found myself, as an emerging national figure, reading the big book and trying to understand where I had failed and why I was empty and why I had to turn to God. And I think that had I not had that experience and I had not had that intervention, I might literally have collapsed totally. And that was really the beginning of turning my life around and beginning to help me understand. And it's, I've been very, very fortunate and very blessed. Clifton and I have a wonderful marriage. We're very close to our 2 daughters, Kathy and Jackie, and their husbands. And as many of you know, I'm extremely close to Maggie and Robert, who are my 2 grandchildren. But all of that has required a great deal of pain, some of which I have caused, others which I regret deeply. All of it has required having to go to God to seek both reconciliation, but also to seek God's acceptance, that I had to recognize how limited I was and how much I had to depend on Him. And I was asked at one of the events we did whether I'd be comfortable with somebody who was an atheist as president. And I answered from the heart, which is I said no. And the reason is simple. I think if it's, we once had a friend who was a recovering alcoholic who was approached by a federal official who said, if you all could drop the 2nd step, we could fund the other 11 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. But the 2nd step's the one that says you recognize there's a higher being. And he said to me, I think you misunderstand why it works. And if you said to me, we were electing somebody who believed that they by themselves were strong enough to be President of the United States, I would tell you that person terrifies me because they completely misunderstand how weak and how limited any human being is.
Well, who's next?
I'll give it a try. I think my most difficult issue to deal with is I'm my own worst critic, and I have to put up my imperfection. I don't know whether it works with anybody else, but I can't stand watching myself on TV because all I see are my imperfections. And that is what I strive for, is to try to learn and try to improve my delivery and try to deliver a message which I think is honest and true. And I think I come up short because I think I always can do better. But to find one incident where I think I really goofed it or I had to suffer through it, it's almost arrogant to think that I can't find any one thing. If I'd have only done this, things would have been much better off. So I have been so pleased, to be able to participate in the great debates of our country and to be able to practice medicine. And I think that my greatest thing, in family, I've had a great family. I've been married 54 years, have 5 kids, 18 grandchildren, 5 great grandchildren.
So no failures.
So everything is wonderful.
So no failures.
So, but the biggest struggle I had, it seems so incidental, and I don't know whether anybody ever goes through it, but it's something in a teenage year. Teenage years are important psychologically, but compared to what I've received and what I've been able to do and enjoy, it seems so incidental. And that was a physical problem, because I probably had set for a pretty darn good career in athletics, particularly in track and maybe in football and maybe even baseball. But I had some severe injuries, and I really never recovered from them to get to my top speed again. And that was a problem for me. And a teenager, I think maybe we can understand it as a teenager, but now that I look back, why was it such a big deal for me? But it was a big deal for me, but I think I overcame it.
Anybody, you don't have to answer this question, and we only have limited time.
I have been very successful in my business life, and I owe that success to God Almighty being in my life throughout those experiences. I have been able to achieve some things with organizations that were not expected to be achieved. No one is perfect, and I believe that I have had a series of little failures rather than one great big disaster. One little failure in my mind was I didn't believe that I was home enough when my kids were growing up.
And what do you say to them about that now?
Well, I gotta stop doing this.
I feel like Dr. Phil.
So you don't have to worry about being fired, because then you have another job to be a Dr. Phil. And because my wife had been that nucleus of the home, because I traveled so much, that was the sacrifice I made to be able to climb those corporate ladders. But my wife was that rock. She was that nucleus, and she was there, and I always wanted to be home and spend more time with them, but I couldn't because of the demands of my business life. And so if I had it to do all over again, probably the failure was not trying a little harder to be there more with them while they were growing up. But now here's the blessing of God. They never said, "Dad, you need to be home more." They never expressed any anger that I wasn't there. They've always supportive, and they're still supportive today in any of the endeavors that I undertake. But if I thought about one that I judged as a failure, would have wanted to have been home more with the kids.
We're going to turn to the next segment, Governor Perry, last one.
And it will be brief, and I'm reminded of that saying that we've all heard. If you want to see God laugh, tell him your plans. And I always wanted to be a veterinarian. Ever since I had memory, I wanted to be a veterinarian, to go to Texas A&M, that scoutmaster and it was all planned. I wanted to be a veterinarian and marry that woman on the front stage. And then he introduced me to organic chemistry. And I became a pilot in the United States Air Force, but thank God I got to marry that woman on the front row. And so he has blessed me greatly all of my life. I'm telling you, I'm the most blessed guy sitting at this table, and I thank him every day for letting me have her.
What I would like to do is turn it over to my colleague for a series of questions.
Hi, I'm Brian Brown, President of the National Organization for Marriage. My first question is for Dr. Paul. We've heard from others of their support of a federal marriage amendment. Would you support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution defining marriage as the union of one man and one woman?
No, I have taken a position that I would not support. I support DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, But I would prefer, under our system of laws, that all these problems be taken care of in a constitutional manner, which I would defer to the states. But actually, I would go even a little bit further. Me personally, my personal beliefs, although it's not likely to be achieved in my lifetime, is traditionally throughout our Christian, Judeo-Christian history, it was usually dealt with by the church. And I think the reason we fight and fume over this is because we have too much government everywhere. So I would say that the church should make this decision. That's the most important place to determine marriage. When you think about in the Old Testament, when the God that led the people out of Egypt was not a king. They didn't have a king. And then when they got to the Holy Land, they had judges. They didn't have kings dictating and ruling. But the family dealt with this, and the family dealt with marriages. But they had a judge to determine this. Matter of fact, when the people came to Samuel and said, look, we need more rules and more laws. We want more government to tell us what to do, and we need more of this. Samuel was old and ready to retire, and he says, no, that's a bad mistake. You don't need more rules and more government. You don't need this. The government will overreact. And today, I think this is what has happened to us. We have deferred to the federal government. We have way too much government. We should go in the other directions. Before you know it, the next step, what if the next step is, wouldn't it be wonderful if the United Nations defined marriage? I don't want to go up that way. I want to go back down all the way to the family and the church. Believe me, it would be a happier and more peaceful world if we went in that direction rather than asking the government and asking the king to solve all these problems. We need the family to deal with it, and we can take our message and learn something from the Old Testament, how there was such a strong emphasis on the patriarchal society and the disputes settled by judges rather than looking for big government.
Given that we have the Perry case working up to the United States Supreme Court, which would essentially say that the U.S. Constitution demands the redefinition of marriage, this is the case coming out of California. For some of you presidential candidates, maybe we'll start with Senator Santorum, that believe in the federal marriage amendment. Why do you believe it's necessary?
Well, if you look back at what happened with Roe versus Wade, we had a variety of different states through either the legislature or through the courts establish the right to an abortion. And the abortion movement didn't have the pro-life movement didn't have their act together, didn't go out and fight as vigorously as they should have in the states. And what happened was one of these laws eventually went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked around and said, hey, we can't have different laws on what life is and whether abortion is legal from one state to another. It has to be uniform. And so we're going to step in and make it uniform. This is exactly what's going to happen with same-sex marriage unless we go out in the states and fight it right now. I'm all for a federal marriage amendment. I helped draft the federal marriage amendment when I was in the United States Senate. There's only been one vote on the floor of the United States Senate on a federal marriage amendment, and I forced the vote. There hasn't been one since I left. I'm all for doing that, but we have to stop this problem, particularly like here in Iowa where it's court imposed. We have to stop this problem in the states, get it on the ballot. I know you're trying here. You've got a state senator from Council Bluffs that makes it really hard to get things done here, which I know you're going to try to change in this next election. But we have to fight the battles in the states. We cannot defer. We can't say the 10th Amendment, they can do what they want. This is too important for that. It is a basic and central value. The family is the bedrock of our society. Unless we protect it with the institution of marriage, our country will fall.
Do any of the other candidates want to comment on the necessity for a federal marriage amendment? Yes, Ms.
I'd like to, because I carried and championed the marriage amendment when I was a state senator in Minnesota. I saw when the judges imposed marriage in the state of Massachusetts that Minnesota would likely be the next state, and I knew that that couldn't happen. It was a very unpopular thing in Minnesota when I proposed this amendment, and I was public enemy number one, but I knew it was right. I knew it was the right thing to do. And I stuck with it despite the odds. Our family, we had to get our children out of the home because of all of the death threats that we had gotten, but I knew it was right, and we persevered. I stayed with that amendment, and I saw that amendment through, and even after I left to go to Congress, I continued to work with my successors, and after 7 years of perseverance in a very unlikely state, we successfully passed it through the legislature, and now in 2012, it will be on the ballot in Minnesota. I'm extremely proud of that, but that isn't the last step. Because of what Senator Santorum said, this will make its way to the Supreme Court. There's no question. President Obama has said he will not uphold the DOMA law, so it will go to the Supreme Court. Because it will go to the Supreme Court will make a decision. Why is it that the big decisions always get made by the Supreme Court? They're not the lawmakers. It's the Congress that are the lawmakers. And so we have to... I will get behind legislation in the Congress, and I will also get behind the federal marriage amendment. I will do whatever it takes, because the first and foremost unit of government in this nation is the family. And the family is defined as one man, one woman, no other definition will do. That's the definition I will champion as President of the United States.
One other question to some of the candidates who haven't spoken yet. If the Perry case or a DOMA case gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court were to overturn DOMA or to find a quote-unquote constitutional, a U.S. constitutional right to same-sex marriage, if you were president, what would you do?
I would lead the charge to overturn the Supreme Court if they overturned DOMA. Whether that was new legislation coming out of the Congress, like Representative Bachmann said, the United States Congress is supposed to pass law. So if they did overturn DOMA, that charge I would lead to reverse that.
One more person. Anybody? Nobody? Governor?
Now, look, part of the purpose of singling out Judge Barry and eliminating his job is to communicate the standard that the two elected branches have the power and the authority to educate the judiciary when it deviates too far from the American people. And I think you would probably take that approach. You might you could repass DOMA and make it not appealable to the court. Period.
We have two additional questions.
Thank you.
We have two additional questions. This is a family forum, and so we wanted to make sure that a mom was heard. And I'd like to introduce the gasp from behind me. Cafe Mom is the largest online site for moms. As a mom, what question would you ask the Republican candidates for president?
Hi, and thank you for having me, and thank you to Cafe Mom for providing this opportunity. What I'd like to know is if you believe in the idea of a common good, and if you do, I'd like to know what you believe the federal government's role in supporting it should be.
Can you relay that?
Yes, do you believe in the idea of a common good, and what should the role of the federal government be in pursuing a common good? Anybody?
Well, I think the founding fathers would have said that the purpose of government is to establish the framework within which the individual, the family, and the community seek a common good, but that the government itself should not define or impose a politically defined common good. And I think they would have said the job is to protect the weak by having the rule of law and to create an orderly process by which you can spend your lifetime pursuing happiness, remembering again that happiness in the 18th century meant wisdom and virtue, not hedonism and acquisition.
Yeah. And happen to think that the constitutional focus upon our common good and the welfare of the people really is very narrowly defined when you talk about the issue of public safety, for instance, to make sure that you and your family can live in a community that is safe. I think it's one of the reasons our federal government has failed so miserably, because of their failure to secure the border with Mexico. And we have these drugs that are coming into our country, poisoning our children. Having the ability to secure that border, and it's one of the things that I've talked about, having been the governor of the state of Texas for the last 10 years, having to deal with the public safety issue with a border that the federal government fails to recognize is porous, that criminality is happening on it on a regular basis, and to shut that border down, to secure that border. And so the common good is not just about the public safety, it's also about the economics. And having you be able to keep more of your money. Because, you know, having a tax structure and a regulatory climate in place that allows for Americans to be able to keep more of their money. It's the reason I laid out that flat tax concept. It's the reason I talked about pulling back those regulations and having them tested to find out whether or not they actually benefit or they just cost us and cost us jobs. So those are the two places when we talk about the common good, is obviously the defense of this country, the security of this country, and the economic security of the family.
Very quickly.
I would like to answer by way of some examples. Governor Perry already mentioned defense. Common good. Enforced laws. We cannot become a lawless society. Enforced laws. Secondly, the common good is to establish a level playing field for everybody to be able to compete equally in this country. That's in the common good. Thirdly, fairness and respect. The reason that we had to have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is because it wasn't fair and respectful of all people. And then after that, we got rid of the separate water fountains. We got rid of, you know, some people having to ride in the front of the bus and the back of the bus. That's all in the common good. Those things that do not single out individuals to provide particular favors, but those things that levels the playing field such that everybody can be treated equally, fairly, and with respect and dignity.
Allow me to ask, by a show of hands, how many of you are first-time voters? Do we have any here? Any up on stage? We've got a couple that are over there. We wanted to give a student the opportunity, Becca Kramer, to ask a question as well, since once again, this is a family forum.
Hi, yes, I'm from Northwestern College, and my question on education for the panel is it a responsibility of schools to help our children learn right from wrong, and if so, how? Or should they simply focus on the basics of reading, math, and science?
I'd be happy to take that since I have 7 children. We homeschool our kids, so we have a lot of experience in this regard. I can tell you that the education system in this country is fundamentally broken, period. And the reason it's broken is because it is a system that was designed over 100 years ago to educate children writ large in an institutional setting. Business community used to do that. You know, when you had the Model T, they cranked out one version and this is what you got. But we've changed a lot since then. We should have an education system that focuses on the customer of the education system. And unfortunately in America, the educational establishment has convinced Americans, the American customer of the education system, that they're not the customer anymore. And of course, the customer is not the child, it's the parents. Why? Because they pay for it, but more importantly, it's a parent's responsibility to educate their children. And we take that very seriously. We homeschool our children. We think that that's best for us, and it's not necessarily best for everybody. But what is important is that we have an educational system in this country that is designed to work with each parent to design an educational experience for every child that is customized to give them the best possible chance. How many people in this room are only concerned about, when it comes to raising your children, about their academic achievement? Nobody. I don't know if anybody in America is only concerned about that, yet that's all we measure. That's all we focus on in the public school system. It is broken, and the only way we get around it is to customize the system so we have all sorts of options for parents to give their child exactly what they need. And don't tell me there's not enough money. We got tons of money that we're spending on the education system, but it's spent on the institution. It is not focused on what's best for the parents and determining what's best for their child.
Representative Bachman.
I appreciate the fact that the question about the common good came from a mother, and also that it was a woman that asked the question about education. Because as a mother myself, there is nothing more important to me than those little lives that we raised. And I didn't give birth to them. Moms didn't give birth to these kids so that they become wards of the state or servants of the state. We raise these kids to grow up and be happy, fulfilled adults, to carry on our society and live wonderful, fulfilled lives. That's what we want. How do they achieve that? They achieve that by all that we pour into them as little people, but then also through the education system. This is what moms are concerned about. That is a common good. And I think what we want to do is make sure that we don't have the federal government involved in education. We want to make sure that education stays as close to the family as we possibly can, and then the family makes that decision, because teaching them right and wrong really does come from mom and dad. And mom and dad get that from their values, and how their values are informed by their religious faith. That's where that comes from. So we need to empower every parent in the United States to be able to have true education choice for their child, so they make the decision about how they're educated, where they're educated, so they can have the best possible chance in life. That's what we want for the next generation. You asked, will that next generation be better off than we have been? This is where it all starts. In the home, with their education. Nothing could possibly be more important for mothers, to make sure they have that chance. That's why parents have to be empowered, so those kids have the best possible chance.
Our final question. Every one of the six of you have talked about the importance of preserving life. And nothing takes life more than the declaration of war. I would like to hear from you, because nothing frightens a mother more than watching her son or daughter go off. Their pride in their country, but their fear for their child. Can you define the moral justification for war? You can use Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. What is the moral justification? Representative Paul.
You know, the early church struggled with this. I mean, Christ came, Christ taught about peace, and Christ was to be the Prince of Peace, and we were to defend that. But early on, the church struggled with this, and St. Augustine came up with the principles of the just war. I believe in them. I think we should follow those from a religious viewpoint, but we have a constitution that is very clear to guide us to try to prevent these wars. And that is that we don't go to war without a declaration. The wars that we have fought since World War II are all illegal, unconstitutional, immoral, and all were unwinnable, and it was tragic. It was tragic because we did it by failing the rule of law, and the tragedy now of these wars of the past 10 years. 10 years, and we have been so complacent. It added $4 trillion to our national debt. 8,500 Americans have been killed in these wars. 44,000 have come home wounded and crippled. Hundreds of thousands are looking for help. And we want to blind ourselves to this. And it isn't in our national defense. It was mischief. It's getting involved where we don't need to be involved. I think it is an utter tragedy of what's happening. And if you want to talk about a family life, there has to be somebody in this audience that has been the bearer of bad news, either a loved one lost or a loved one crippled. And it's on and on. I had one soldier come to me the other day, and he was so against the wars, and he spent 3 or 4 tours over there. And he says, I lost so many buddies, and I don't know why we were there, and there's no signs of progress over there. But he says, now I'm losing my buddies to suicide. The wars destroy the family, undermine the family, as does the economic climate. The bad economics and war is the 2 most destructive things to the family, and we ought to concentrate on that, and we can't concentrate on the economics unless you look at the business cycle, why we have inflation, busts and booms. Otherwise, we will continue on a downhill path.
I am a mother, and I've made the most difficult calls of my life, which has been when servicemen and women have lost their lives in my congressional district. And I've picked up that phone, and I've called mothers, and I've called fathers, and I have wept with them over the phone, because nothing is more difficult to lose a child.
So what is the definition? What is the moral justification for war?
The moral justification for war is if the United States is attacked, or if we are threatened with attack, then we have a decision that we have to make, because the #1 duty of Commander-in-Chief is to secure the safety of the American people. That is the duty. And in order to do that, I have to be convinced as Commander-in-Chief that we have a clearly defined American vital interest in that area. And I need to know that we also have a clear mission to go forward. We have a plan and an exit strategy. And when we go in, I will commit overwhelming force, and then we get out. Now, some situations are ones where you can have special operations forces, and then you have to have the tools to be able to deal with interrogation, which we don't have now under Obama. You have to have the ability to have detention, like we don't have now under President Obama. But we have to have a clearly defined interest. And I think we also have to take advice from George Washington, who told us rightly so. I'm not an isolationist, but he said very carefully, be very fearful of unnecessary foreign entanglements. And if there's anything we've learned from the last 12 years, once you get in, it's very difficult to get out. And so you go in wisely.
Mr. Kaine, and then Governor Perry.
In the Declaration where it says, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and then it delineates 3 of them: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It said that among these are those 3. I happen to think that there was another one that was implied: the right to protect yourself, your family, to protect your property. So the defense of freedom and the defense of liberty, I believe, is the moral justification for going to war. Secondly, as Commander-in-Chief, I will not send our young men and women into war unless it is clear why, the mission and the definition of victory. And thirdly, I will not send them into war unless I would send my own son and daughter.
Governor Perry.
As a former individual who's worn the uniform of this country, as the Commander-in-Chief of over 20,000 troops that are at my command today in the state of Texas with our Guard, I've been dealing with this issue for 10 years. And clearly, when America's interests are in jeopardy, there is a time and a place for us to intervene and intervene militarily. But when we intervene militarily, we best make the decision of how we are going to win and how we are going to win convincingly and quickly, send those young men and women with the equipment to win, Don't let some congressman sitting in an air-conditioned office in Washington, D.C. deciding what the rules of engagement are. Let those war fighters win the wars. Let them come home victorious. That's what the American military man and woman's all about. And for us to micromanage them in a civilian way, without their commanders truly being in charge, is absolutely irresponsible, and as the commander-in-chief of this country, I will not let it happen.
Let me try to just maybe drill it down to a more practical application. We're engaged in what many people call the long war. Americans have known to have a rather short attention span. And that's because we're a young country. You know, an antique for us is 100 years old. In the Middle East, it's 2,000 years old. They have a very different view of time and of history. And as a result, when we are engaged in this long war, long to us is not the same as long to them. What we're facing right now is something that is, again, read our history. There's a 1,000-year conflict between radical Islam and the West that ended only because of the West's great superiority and was able to defeat them and drive them back and eventually colonize the Middle East. But that changed with a three-letter word: oil. Oil allowed the radical elements within the Islamic world to be able to get access to technology. And now we have, in the case of Iran, to drill it down even more, a radical theocracy that has been at war with us since 1979, who's done more to kill our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan than anybody else because they're the makers of the IEDs that are killing our troops. They've attacked this country on repeated occasions, Khobar Towers, through proxies, as well as in Beirut. They attempted an assassination of an ambassador. They have threatened openly and repeatedly our closest allies. They hold conventions in Tehran denying the Holocaust. In fact, most of the Islamic world in the Middle East now believes the Holocaust didn't even occur.
So should we declare war?
Justification for the state of Israel.
Should we
they
declare?
are now, well, yeah, they are now developing a nuclear weapon. It is apparent that they are doing so. International agencies, not necessarily the boldest group of folks, have suggested that that is the case. We have a moral obligation to partner with the state of Israel to assure their survival and to make sure that this radical regime that wants to spread its virulent form of radical Islam, not just throughout the Middle East, but throughout the world, is stopped from having the ability to do so with impunity, because that's what a nuclear weapon does. It gives you a nuclear shield. It must be stopped. I laid out a plan the other day, and I know we're short on time, that lists 4 major things that we should do: covert activities, sanctions, overturning the regime, but also working with Israel right now to plan a military option and that's to strike and destroy these facilities, and let the Iranians know that unless they open up their facilities and shut them down, that is an option that will be used. Period.
You have the last word. Is there a moral justification? What is the moral justification for war?
First of all, as Congressman Paul pointed out, in Christian theology, there's a clear development of the concept of the just war, which people like Augustine had to develop because they were seeing the rise of pagans that were actually threatening the very survival of their country. And in fact, Augustine is buried in Italy because his body was taken out of North Africa when Christians lost North Africa. So I mean, these things become very real. My dad served 27 years in the Army. I watched my mother through that whole period, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I think what makes us different, and what makes us in some ways, when we have good leadership, much more ruthless and much tougher than any other country in the world, is we don't send soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen to war. We send our children, we send our fathers, we send our brothers and sisters, we send our mothers, and therefore there's a preciousness to this decision unlike any other country I know of. I think our position historically, remember, the Declaration of Independence is signed by a group of people who are going to fight an 8-year war. It is a declaration of war in Great Britain, in effect. Washington is in the field 8 years with 1 week at Mount Vernon. These people who wrote these documents understood the grim reality. I believe we should not go to war if we can avoid it. And when we have to go to war, we should do so decisively, with overwhelming power, to seek the quickest possible victory. And we should, in fact, be quite prepared to do whatever it takes to win once we begin an engagement. But I think that there's no question. I would like the planet, and this is one of the places I disagree with some of my friends. You come into our country and you kill 3,100 people, and we will do whatever it takes to eliminate your capacity to threaten us ever again. And I would be tougher and more decisive. And I agree entirely with Senator Santorum. I would say to the government in Iran today, you have a very short time to solve this on your own. And if you don't, we will solve it for you. And we frankly couldn't care less what the rest of the world thinks. We're going to get it done.
Ladies and gentlemen of Des Moines, of Iowa, and all those watching, one of these ladies or gentlemen may be your next President of the United States. I hope you feel more secure. I hope you feel more informed. We have about 6 weeks, I guess, until the caucuses. I think you've performed admirably. You have a number of debates. If you are as civil then as you have been here, it'll go very well for all of us come next November. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much.